Hi, I'm Michael Eager. I'm the local secretary of San Francisco Regional Mensa. I'm happy to welcome you to our speaker meeting for today. And our guest today is George Towner. George joined Mensa in the 1960s. He's one of the first members that I met when I moved to California in 1977. He's been around Mensa for a long time. Among other things, he ran the Asilomar treasure hunt for many years, which everybody enjoyed and were amazed at. Today's talk is about a semi-scientific research project he started in the 1970s in his spare time. It's called digital reality theory. It's not highly technical, so don't have to worry about that. He says it's mostly common sense at a Mensa level. He's published 5 books about it. It's not a frivolous blue sky thing. Without further ado, here's George.
Hi, folks. I want to thank Mike and Susan and Pia and everybody for helping to get me on the air here. And this talk is, I will reiterate what Mike said, this talk is not highly technical, and it should be fairly interesting to Mensa members, even though it is about philosophy, and this is not the picky academic philosophy because I've never been an academic, but this is a project that I've been handling for about 50 years, and anyway, I hope you will enjoy it. So now I'm going to switch to some slides, which will occupy the next 30 minutes, and then we'll have questions and discussion. You may question why somebody with no real academic chops is allowed to do such a thing, and that's because I found myself in an interesting position. I got a master's degree in philosophy and did various things, including manufacturing automatic weather stations. I founded a company for that and got a couple of patents on digitizing, which led me to question some of the things that were going on in science. And then I got lured over to Apple Computer by a Mensa member, actually, and became an employee for 35 years of Apple. At the beginning, Apple was trying to figure out how to build computers, and I suddenly realized that by watching the decisions that went into making a computer, I might learn something about how human knowledge works. And that became my project, and I did that for 35 years and published 5 books. So, in order to understand more about this, I went back to the beginning of science, modern science. And here's a trivia question for you. In 1931 or 1831, how many scientists were there in the world? And the answer is 0, because the word scientist did not exist in 1831. In 1832, at a meeting of the British Society for the Advancement of Science, a man named William Whewell, who was a master of Trinity College, sort of complained in his keynote address that everybody in the room was practicing what they called natural philosophy, but that sounded, he didn't say wimpy, but he implied that sounded kind of wimpy. And according to one account, a hand went up in the back of the room and somebody said, well, if art is created by artists, shouldn't science be created by scientists? That was the first time anybody had ever heard that word. And by acclamation, it was accepted. And at that instant, everybody in the room became a scientist. And they gained a reputation for truth, because science is a Latin word for truthful knowledge. So science was launched, modern science was launched in the 1840s. Whewell sat down and wrote a 2-volume book telling scientists what they ought to be doing. And the only problems he had was that there were still some things to be added to science that he had no concept of. One of them was evolution, which Darwin didn't publish until 12 years after he published his book. So he was perfectly convinced that the entire universe had been created 6,000 years earlier by divine will. And his book is filled with facts. You can get his book today from Amazon and read it. And it's full of facts. He believed that once you determined a fact, that was that. You pinned it to the wall and you went on up and determined another fact. And that was what science was about. And he had no concept of things like set theory, which was founded in 1874, or of multimedia digitization, which is something I know a little about, and which didn't really begin to happen until the 1950s. So I was suspicious at first that science had some stuff in its foundation that it didn't need or should be changed. Now, here's the answer page. I'm going all the way to the back of the book. This is what digital theory is. This is its 7-word explanation. Life understands existence by constructing digital realities. Well, what does that mean? Here's a picture I made of what that means. You can imagine, first of all, everything you see there is existence. Existence is in fact everything, but part of it is life, which exists. And within life are things that I call digital realities, which life has constructed in order to understand itself and the rest of existence. And the only problem is that the digital realities are digital and existence is not. So if I had been able to say life understands existence by constructing digital realities to St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, he would have understood me perfectly except for one word, digital. So first I'm going to define these terms as best I can. And then I'm going to explore what it really means if you have inside you a digital representation of the non-digital world outside of you. First of all, there used to be a joke in the philosophy department at Berkeley that you can't ask the question, what is life? Because only living things can ask questions. And when you ask the question, you are admitting that you already know what the answer is. Okay? So that's what life is. You know what it is because you are part of it. Understanding and constructing are pretty common words, and I don't use them in any much different way than anybody else uses them, except that only life does those things. Only life understands, only life constructs. I realize that there are processes that go on in the sun, but they're not construction as I understand it. Anyway, existence is everything, and realities are a part of existence that life constructs and understands. And the only word here that needs a little more explanation is digital. And because I have imported axiomatic set theory into digital reality theory, digital is anything that can be the element of a set, which means it can be handled by axiomatic set theory. One of the first things I learned was that humans are digital animals. Our genome is expressed digitally when we are made from a zygote. The genome that is passed down to us is a digital code, basically. And when we learn to use languages, we use discrete digital words. We don't sing to each other. Well, some tribes do in fact sing to each other, but that's sort of a corner case. And interestingly enough, it was learned in the early 20th century that our responses obey something called the all or none law. And what that is a discovery that when a stimulus reaches either a nerve or a muscle in any animal, nothing happens until the stimulus reaches a certain level, and then everything happens. There is no middle ground. It's all or none. Complete response or none, which corresponds to the 0 and 1 that computers use. In other words, we are constantly changing what maybe you might call analog data into digital responses. And this happens all over our bodies, and it happens all the time. Then finally, at the bottom, I have a quote that I like from a guy named John Soa, who's a computer scientist. I put in boldface the words continuous and discrete, because that's really the difference here. What he's saying is that science studies continuous things, which is like raw existence, but what people understand are discrete things. And in fact, science constantly converts discontinuous, what science calls phenomena, into discrete statements, forcing the process of science to be digitized, whether that's appropriate for it or not. Here is an example of a digital user interface. This is the this is the famous London tube map. You can find this on Wikipedia, by the way. But I find it interesting because it is a picture of London in effect, but only the parts of London that consist of sets of steps going down from the sidewalk down into the earth. But it's what you need to know to get around London. If you have a map of the city without this, it's very hard to use the underground. Yet this is not a diagram or a picture of a railway either. because it's not drawn to scale, and if you actually looked at where the trains are going under the ground, it's quite different from what this shows. This diagram was concocted in the 1930s by an employee of the underground whose main job was making wiring diagrams. But this is the sort of thing that I mean when I talk about digitizing reality, making a digital reality out of a non-digital reality. Here's a more familiar example of that. You're probably all familiar with the way that a cathode ray tube produces a picture. And at one end of it is basically a dot of light of varying intensity. The first three stages of digitization are performed by the cathode ray tube. But then when the human eye looks at it, we convert it, in this case, into the beetles. And we see it move and all that stuff. But if you really came down to it, at any given instant, back in the 1960s and 70s, you'd find the entire family sitting around watching a little dot of light all evening. So what I am getting here at is that digitization is a part of the way we see the world. And so it's important to understand what digitization does, and in particular to understand that there's more than one way to do it. Here are three ways to digitize a familiar image. By the way, the picture on the far right is not all that great because I couldn't find a picture of 1,000 little triangles. But if you're familiar with OpenGL, it's the sort of thing I'm getting at. You can make a picture out of geometric shapes, and you get a lot of benefits out of that. Well, in particular, if you look at what computers do, on the left is what's called bitmapping, and most text is drawn that way using what are called Bezier curves. Each character is actually outlined as if you were drawing by the machine, and then filled in with black usually to make a single character. Now, if it gets to a small picture, then the cheapest and simplest way is just to lay down dots of color in a grid. But if you really are going to do interesting work, you build up an image using geometric shapes. And the point here is that there is no standard way to digitize anything. Very simple things like numbers have sort of obvious standards for digitizing them. You understand that a computer never actually handles a real number. What it handles is a binary set that represents the quantity of a number. Interestingly enough, this is not a new idea, that there are these three things, and I've labeled them. I'll come to that in a minute because that's how I began to think of them. Lavoisier, who was one of the brightest men of his time, had his head chopped off for being that. Wrote this in 1789, and the reason I put some boldface in that is that the series of facts is like a physical thing. The abstract concepts are like what I call ideals, and the words are behavioral. And if I were to edit his last line there, I would edit it to say, to call forth an ideal concept, a behavioral word is needed. To portray a physical fact, an ideal concept is needed. All three mirror one and the same reality. And that's sort of from that's sort of the origin of digital reality theory. Okay, how do you handle digital information? You don't handle it using mathematics, even though set theory was invented by a mathematician. By the way, this is the only technical slide I have, so don't get alarmed. But set theory started with one paper published in 1874 that demonstrated that when you put together a bunch of numbers, you could be making a unique thing called a set. Before that, people knew perfectly well you could put numbers together, but they didn't think it meant anything. And by 1922, there was an axiomatic system in place for set theory. And today it's the standard of logic. And to zip to the bottom of the screen, one reason it's important is that you can define the foundations of mathematics using set theory, but not vice versa, which means that the mathematics on which science is founded is logically, well, I would call it it's logically a subset of set theory. Now, I want to explain a power set because that is one of the 9 axioms, the guarantees that you can always make a power set. And a power set is all the ways you can put together the elements of a set to make a new set. The example in the middle, if the set you start with is X, Y, and Z, then its power set is a set that contains 9 sets inside it. One of them is the so-called null set or empty set, which is present in every set. Then there are 3 sets that are just a single element. And there are 3 more sets that are 2 of the elements. And then there's 1 set, which is the whole thing repeated. And this is, in effect, a toolkit for making new sets out of existing sets. If you were handed X, Y, and Z, then you can look inside its power set and see an example of all the possible sets that could be made from the elements X, Y, and Z. And that is important because that becomes one of the pillars of digital reality theory. So let's look for an example of how set theory actually works in practice. And I'm trying to be fairly realistic here. The knife that's shown on the left-hand side, the blade is on the left end and the handle's on the right end. The blade is a sharpened piece of stone. The handle is the end of a deer antler. And the stone is shoved into the antler and then it's bound up with sinew. So if you treated that as a set, that knife, that physical knife, then you would call it a set containing a blade and a handle. And the whole idea of set theory is that the knife, the blade, and the handle are now three separate things. You started with two things, and now you have a third thing, which is them put together, and it's different. A knife is not a kind of blade, and it's not a kind of handle. It's both of them together. But there's more than that. You can also categorize the knife. You can give it some meaning, some kind of role in the world. And here I am giving it three roles. One is a behavioral role, as something you use in fighting. And another is what it was probably originally made for, which was as a kind of tool for scraping animal skins and, you know, doing various household jobs. But it can also be a symbol. If any of you folks have been to Amritsar, India, which is the center of the Sikh religion, you see that Sikh men always carry a knife in their belt as a symbol, not only of religion, but of their manhood, I guess. And that means that the same thing, whether it's physical or whatever, can be seen different ways, depending on what you're using it for or how you think of it. Now, I want to add one more thing to this. And you have what I regard as a genuine breakthrough, that if you talk about the world in terms of sets, that everything is a set of something, then you can make a set that contains all the behavior that all the living things do, and another set that contains all the physical objects that we work with, and another set that are all the ideals that we have. And these are power sets of each other. Now, how do I know they're power sets? Well, because behavior is organized in a timeline. It's what's called a countable set. You can take the items, you can take the things you do during the day and put them end to end in a string, whereas physical reality is not countable in that sense. Every time you examine a physical thing, if you take it apart, you find more and more stuff inside it. And this was part of Cantor's original concept and why he was able to claim that sets were in fact real things, because it turned out the set of all integers was infinite. The infinite set of all the integers was smaller than the infinite set of all the points in a line in a very fundamental way. And in fact, they sort of created two worlds. And then there was another set of all the possible functions of all the points in a line, which was even bigger than both of them. And that's where the power set came in. It shows what you can do with behavior. If behavior gives you some data about something physical, then the power set tells you all the ways that that data could be realized in a physical thing. And once you understand the physical thing that realizes all that data, then another power set tells you all the possible ways that physical thing could function in a situation where it's moving, for example, or changing in some way, or being associated with other physical things. And that these are in effect three different worlds. And what I've added in digital reality theory that I believe nobody else has come up with is the idea that the power set combines these things. By the way, these can be associated with our old friends from Descartes, mind and matter, and the medieval idea of essences. Mind is behavior, and matter is physical reality, and essences are ideals. And this links them together. This closes the whole arrangement, in my opinion. So what is this good for? Well, one of the things that I'm fairly into in my books is applying this to sociology. Now, what this figure shows, the round things are the things that I was just looking at my watch. We're still on time. The round things are the sources of categories for the digital realities that we know. And what they're pointing to is the things they categorize. So if you start at the bottom of this and look at communalism, you've got physical categories, which are the needs of, in a typical example, the needs of an infant. And then you have behavior, which is guided by those categories to be behavior appropriate to serve the needs of an infant. If you reverse that, you have behavior as a source categories to regulate physical reality, which is the kid growing up who needs to be told what he can do, and he or she, and what's a no-no and all that. And again, when you attend school, your behavior is regulated. You're quiet in the classroom and you're sitting there and the teacher is talking and so forth. But what you're soaking up is ideals, mostly when you're at school. If you go the other direction, the ideals are already set up for you, and your job is simply to absorb them into your behavior and practice your religion. And when you drive a car, the ideals or the laws, the rules of the road, and the physical reality is what you actually do with your car. And the final one here. I put down voting in a democracy because that's one of the ways that we pick out what ideals we want to categorize and what their categories should be. But it also can represent other political systems, and I won't go into that. One interesting thing about looking at these kinds of things in terms of sets is that you can hook them up end to end. There's two ways you can take the ones. I'm going to go back to the previous slide so you can see how these are connected. See, one of them is simply going around in clockwise, and the other is going around it in counterclockwise. But in individualism, I think a frontier community where the land is out there ready to be planted or mined or built on, and that you form a communalism to get people together to go out and do something, go out and make a life for themselves. And then in election, they get together and decide what laws will govern them, and then they apply the laws. And that's an individualistic way to organize a society. The statist way is by reversing all of those. The physical reality is given. You already own a factory or you own a bunch of farms, and they need to be operated or taken care of or run in some way. And so you work out the ideals that apply to getting that job done, and then you make that the ideals that categorize the behavior of people, and then you force the people to do what, or you encourage them to do what it takes to accomplish the physical tasks. This is just one example of what you can do once you are in the into the digital world. That's the key here. If you can't do any of this by following normal science and measuring things and applying statistics and so forth and so on. This requires the use of digital concepts and set theory. So we're finally getting to the kind of stuff that I've been working on more recently, and frankly, I'm still new at this myself, so anybody who wants to contact me and help is encouraged to do so. The insight that started all this, I've been unable to draw a slide of it, so I'll try to just describe it. It's the peculiarity that Einstein noticed that the propagation of radiant energy through space is invariant, it's fixed. Every other physical motion can be changed, but that is unchangeable. And why is that? Well, he thought that was just the way things were with existence. But I've come up with an idea that baked into our DNA way at the beginning which we still carry with us, is a bunch of stuff that life learned a long time ago. And you'll notice in this chart on the left-hand side that the first life on Earth, about 4,000, this is actually 4 billion years ago, was little single cell things. And at that time on the Earth, there was mainly water, and there were hot places. They exist even today, the hot springs in the bottoms of oceans. And life somehow came up with the idea of using the heat down there to build itself and to make things happen. But that's a very chancy way. As evolution proceeded, you can't do much with that. And then this marvelous thing was discovered, that there was a star out there, 93 million miles away, that you could get energy from, called the sun. And the only problem with it was that we whirled around it, and I whirled on our own axis and went around it in an orbit, and it was constantly being somewhere else. And how do you develop something as simple-minded as a plant, or indeed as a chloroplast, that'll figure this out and be able to find the sun every day? And the answer was to come up with a dimensional system in which that delivery of solar energy was unchanging. Now, I don't have a full concept of what such a dimensional system must be like, but I do know that it must be tailored to our planet and the way we move around in the Sun-Earth system, in order to keep the delivery of light energy constant. And there might well be other forms of life that arose that, for example, may have grown up on a planet that faces a sun but doesn't go around it, just fully faces it. So the sun never moves. And it may have an entirely different way of distributing its dimensions and understanding how energy moves. And one of the things that means is that if we and they tried to communicate with each other, things would get very peculiar, because we would have a set of dimensions based on one concept of the way the world works, and they would have a different one. And for example, maybe a contact would consist of the other guys appearing for a 60th of a second in a different part of the sky all the time, so that the only way we could take a picture of it would be with some sort of camera that knew where the next 60th of a second was going to be and swung around to find it. And anyway, so I've been looking at the foundations of life, and I'm listing them here, and what they got for us. Life itself, its achievement was to create behavior, and that makes the behavior of life sort of sort of like an aberration in existence. That once it's got a foothold, it could survive itself by developing time. You can't have survival of the fittest unless you have time, because time tells you whether you survived or not, doesn't it? And so that would have to be one of the foundational concepts that life worked out first. And then once it had an understanding that there was physical possibilities, which it would get from the power set operation, then it could duplicate itself, because it did that in physical reality rather than in behavior. And that led to a physical understanding. One interesting thing is the DNA molecule, which apparently is very old, but it records time as the spatial distribution of codons on a long stringy molecule. So it's actually recording time in space terms and so forth, which leads to the formation of species, because what a species does is hands on the DNA to new creatures, and so on and so on. And this is a very pioneering sort of concept, this slide here. And if I ever get sent to the funny farm, it'll be because of this. So that would then modify the diagram that I showed to show that there are foundational adaptations at the bottom of life, one of which I've tried to show simply as we have a special time space that we evolved as an adaptation so we could live on the earth and get energy from the sun while whirling around it. And I would also add the orders of understanding, which started with just behavior and then went to physical, and finally we're about the only forms of life that use ideals a lot, although there are some pretty smart animals out there, dolphins and whales and crows and so forth. But anyway, we would have to take that into account, not only in understanding life, but in doing basic science. This is what I'm talking about here. Don't ignore this stuff. Don't believe that all these things were just sort of part of the world placed here. That's almost recooking the Adam and Eve story, that, well, this garden was set with the proper delivery of radiant energy for us, all that stuff. All we had to do was live in it. So that's basically what I have to say. This is the commercial here. Feel free to email me with your opinions. And you can buy my latest book. It's only $4.50 on Amazon. Okay, over to you, Michael.
Great, thank you. We do have a couple questions. Judy asked a couple. If only life constructs, how do you define a digital reality that can construct?
Well, all digital realities are constructed by some life somewhere. That London map is a digital reality that's posted on a wall, but nevertheless, it was thought up and printed by some form of life. There are no digital realities, as far as I know, on the moon, for example. And the moon does not rotate around the Earth because it has understood anything, nor has it constructed anything. It's basically a piece of existence that is not alive, and because it is not alive, it doesn't have any of the stuff that I've been talking about. I guess that's my answer.
She also asks, while not called sets, taxonomy is basically putting every living species into a set. Taxonomy is considered to have started in 1758. Would you consider this to be a precursor to set theory or its origins?
No, I haven't. Generally speaking, set theory is considered to be thought up with Cantor's first article. And I think that's primarily because there's been no, there's no possibility of creating a set of axioms for like Linnaean taxonomy, whereas sets and their elements are sufficiently abstract that you can cook up a logically tight set theory. And the fact that the set theory has been found to provide a foundation for mathematics gives it some authority in the logic world. I don't think that, although taxonomy, well, if you would include taxonomy all the way back to Aristotle, who came up with the idea of categories in the first place. And his categories were very simple, like substance and action were two categories, so that you could say when the horse runs, the horse is categorized as substance and running is categorized as action, that sort of thing. But that's not set theory. Set theory is very, very tightly controlled. You'd have to, I've got a little green book I could lend you that is called The Philosophy of Set Theory. And it explains, why logicians love set theory so much.
I had a question. You mentioned how organisms control reality, and you mentioned about the sun. My tomato plants don't really know when the sun is going to come up. They just know that they get light. They don't really make too many decisions based on that. So how does this, can you expand on this? I don't understand this.
Well, yeah, okay. No, I'm not saying that your tomato plants would not work if they didn't know to grow upward and spread their leaves outward. Okay, now you're talking about 3 dimensions right there. And if plants just sort of grew any which way and hoped to catch some sun, they would fail. Now, the plant doesn't have to be reactive to be smart. All it has to do is find the best possible niche in life to gather the energy it needs. And that, I say, requires a sort of an understanding deep down in the DNA of how you create such positions in a system where things are moving around the way they move around in the Sun-Earth system. And mind you, there were the billion years during which photosynthesis was evolved. So there was plenty of chance to go wrong and go right. And in discussing this in my book, I point out that if light were delivered like lightning, you wouldn't need the other two dimensions. All you have to know is up, and you'd wait until a solar radiation bolt hit you, and then you'd absorb it, and that would be your energy source. So the fact that we have, it's also, to me, a peculiarity that we have, it's not really three dimensions, it's space with 3 degrees of freedom, expressed in vector language. And why 3? Well, I think that was to get plants going. Animals don't need it. Animals basically came along after the plants had created enough oxygen in the atmosphere that the animals could move around and eat the plants. And that was their first stage. Then they got smart enough that they learned how to eat each other. And we may be entering yet another phase, which I won't even go into. But anyway, that's sort of been my thinking on it.
Yeah, I have a 2-part question here. Computers are binary, but human consciousness may be analog, having a range of choices. When you talk of digital reality, do you mean analog or digital?
I would deny that there is such a thing as analog thinking. I think we boil everything down to this or that. Now, I've been back and forth on this. Music sounds very much like an analog, but you will notice that music has migrated into fixed tone scales, and the composers who have tried to fiddle with the fixed tone scales have come up with music that people, generally speaking, don't like and don't understand and don't want. And so my general conclusion is that at least there's a very strong drag towards digitizing everything that we deal with. And I think there's a reason for that too, or several reasons. Life maintains an energy budget, whether it's a plant or an animal or whatever. You've got to have the energy to do what you got to do, and you don't want to waste it. And doing things digitally concentrates your energy. That's why there's this step function all or none law operating. It lets you work as efficiently as possible by saying, okay, this is what I'm going to do about that. There, problem fixed. Not, I'm going to fiddle around with it until something comes up.
Well, at one point with quantum physics, at the tiniest levels, everything is quantized. It's either all or none. It's at this level or that level, and the transitions are abrupt. There's analog behavior is only a macro appearance that comes out of this quantumization.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, yes. I mean, I am happy with quantum physics as a digitization of something else. The only problem I have is when people start saying, well, quantum physics is a picture of the ultimate reality, which in the terms of the people that say this means to me ultimate existence, because the primary thing that digital reality, by the way, I want to call it DR theory, which is what I call it, but one of the ultimate things that DR theory does is it separates what we know from what really is, and makes it clear that some processing has gone on between these two. Existence kicks us around, and then we make a sort of instruction manual of our own devising to tell us what to do in any particular case. And some of it comes automatically to us in our DNA, and some of it is figured out individually. But that's what life does, in my belief.
Okay, we're at really at our end of our time. Thank you very much, George. Glad you were here.
Thanks a lot.